My observation of family friends that include people who are very fit into their 80s and 90s, and even beyond in a few cases, are that, and here these are generalizations based on observation, I want to be clear, that the people I know who are still skiing in their 80s, who are sprinting in their 80s, not as fast as they used to, who are still playing tennis in their 80s. So what I'm referring to here are people that are playing sports that involve dynamic movement, that involve a lot of coordination, and no doubt some resistance, at least of some sort. Like skiing is, there's some resistance involved depending on the complexity of the slope, et cetera. Yeah, and trees. So what do you think is going on there? I mean, there's a rich literature to support the fact that most of our brain volume is there to support vision and movement. And that when we move less, there's brain atrophy. John Rady at Harvard talked a lot about this, even some species of animals that will spend part of their life swimming around and then they'll nest on a rock and then the brain will actually eat itself. And due to the lack of movement, it will just metabolize portions of itself. So the relationship between movement and brain health seems obvious. But how many folks do you see out there in their 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s that are now doing resistance training? Do we know the percentages on that?
I don't. And I was just recently looking at the ACSM guidelines, which is the American College of Sports Medicine, for activity in older individuals. I am not sure the percentage of individuals that are actually doing resistance training. And partially, I'd have to believe that it's less. So again, I trained as a geriatrician. And one of the things that we always saw, not for everybody, but for the majority of people, is it wasn't the duration of the training. They were still, if they were active, they were still active. It was the intensity that they were able to mount. And so because, there's this interesting thing is as we age, some of us are less intense in our training. And it's the actual intensity piece that seems to go down, that when this can be addressed. And what do I mean by intensity? There's a million ways in which I suppose one could define intensity, but it is pushing themselves. Again, are we going to say, is it how many reps, how heavy? But the focus and the intensity of the training goes down.
I guess we could define intensity somewhat loosely, but still fairly by saying, repetitions in the 5 to 10, maybe 12 repetition range, where the final 2 or 3 repetitions are challenging in good form, right? Maybe even to failure in good form. Does that seem like fair?
Yeah, and I would think of the intensity component because the aging literature, it really doesn't seem to matter if people are lifting heavy or light. I used to believe that in order to maintain skeletal muscle mass, especially as hormonal status changes, decrease in testosterone, decrease in estrogen, decrease in progesterone, that the heaviness of the load has to increase. The data doesn't necessarily support that. I would love for that to be the case.
Surprising to me. I
It
would
is
think people would have to push themselves with not extremely heavy loads, but moderately heavy for them.
So it was surprising to me as well. And especially when we worked on some of those earlier studies in Lehman's lab, there's this change in body composition that seems to happen midlife. There's an increase in visceral body fat or central adiposity. And one would think that you require a lot of extra supplements, et cetera, to influence that. But when training and nutrition are accounted for in a very controlled way, body composition changes to the positive. You can lose body fat and increase muscle mass. It'll be very interesting to see as the literature around hormone replacement continues to evolve, especially as it relates to women, because we know that testosterone improves skeletal muscle mass. But that isn't going to be enough if you don't have the foundation in place. And I think that the other big concern is how we're measuring skeletal muscle mass. We mentioned a little bit about DEXA. The more effective way is really MRI, which doesn't seem to be achievable for many people. It's expensive, and CT would be the other way to actually look at muscle quality. Muscle quality right now is defined purely on functional movement measurements, but that's clearly not it. When we define, if you look in the literature, muscle quality is really about the load and the weight and the performance, not about the architecture and the infrastructure of the skeletal muscle. And the reason I say this, let me take a step back, is that in the literature, and you will often hear people say that only strength matters, size doesn't matter. I don't believe that to be true. I believe that we haven't been able to test muscle size appropriately. And when we begin to test it, there's a way, and this is, I think this is being done, it came from a gentleman named Dr. William Evans, and he utilizes something called a D3 creatine, and it's a deuterated tagged creatine. And an individual will ingest a pill. Creatine is largely in skeletal muscle. There may be a small amount in brain, but for the majority of skeletal muscle that's where creatine goes. And so this is a direct way, first time ever. It's been validated. I think it started its utilization in maybe 2019. But when individuals are directly measuring skeletal muscle mass, they find that skeletal muscle mass and strength are both important.